When I got ready to retire, I invited my family to have lunch with me in my office at the agency. And the first thing is I took my boy that was born, that I was supposed to come to the birth for, and I showed him in the book the name of the officer and the date. And I said, that's why I was not at your birth, because of this officer that died here. And that meant a lot.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear a unique combat story from the former director of the CIA's Directorate of Operations and longtime case officer, Jose Rodriguez. Jose's level at the CIA was equivalent to a general officer in the military. To give you just a brief idea of his responsibility and impact, Jose was a case officer and chief of station in several Latin American countries and would eventually lead Latin America division at the CIA before transitioning over to the Counterterrorism Center immediately following 9/11, where he served as the division's chief operating officer, a title he made up in true agency fashion, and then was tapped to lead CTC just months after the invasion of Afghanistan. Jose has a fantastic book titled Hard Measures: How Aggressive CIA Actions After 9/11 Saved American Lives, which recounts not only some of the innovative human ops that he ran as a CO, like his ability to use horses to gain access, but also some of the incredibly challenging decisions he made at the highest levels of the CIA and US government, including the creation of the Enhanced Interrogation Program. This was a really special episode for me, given Jose's role in history at the agency that I love so much, and I hope you enjoy a glimpse behind the curtain of one of the most secretive organizations from someone who went from the very bottom to the very top as much as I did. I just wanted to start out saying thank you so much for taking your time here, sharing your story with us.
My pleasure, Ryan, my pleasure.
And to me, just as we come out of the gates here, like to me, I'm interviewing a legend in the community that I held so dear. So it's really special to just be sitting down and talking with someone of your background and what you did. And we're not getting into any politics. And I would just say thank you for everything you did. I know you took a lot of pain along the way, and people can read your book, Hard Measures. They could see what you went through. You're very transparent about it, but just from one agency professional, I speak on behalf of a lot of them, and to just say thanks for the challenges you took on for us.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I thank you for that. You know, and I get a lot from people coming up to me and thanking me for the decisions that I made, which means tremendously to me, more than anything else. So all good. No regrets whatsoever of anything I did. So all good.
And I was just wondering, I think a lot of people who watch this show are very familiar with the military and its rank structure. They're not familiar with the Senior Intelligence Service structure. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing kind of the level of responsibility as you wrapped up your career, kind of the level that you exited at. I think people don't understand how high that is.
It's interesting because, you know, when I got in November of 1976, you don't know how far this career is going to take you. All you want is to get through training, and then all you want is to get through your first and second assignment, and then you become a chief of station, and you wonder, I mean, you want to do well, and then, you know, so you go on progressing in your career. Never did I imagine that I would go from a career trainee to the DDO, the Deputy Director of Operations. So it was a hell of a ride. And you know, in some cases, just happened to be at the right time, at the right place. For example, after 9/11. So yes, one thing about the agency is they recruit you for being able to walk, to work by yourself and to be in the street and to have the savvy to be able to deal situations in the street. Basically to be a lone wolf. But pretty quickly, you become management. You become, for example, in my case, I became chief of station on my third tour as a GS-12. So pretty quickly, you become management, and it's a completely different world. And eventually, you go up the ranks, and again, usually in the agency, when you go from 15 to SIS, it's a big deal, and that's what you are all looking for. And then anything beyond that is being at the right place at the right time. I had the good fortune of being chief of station a number of times. Last time was Mexico City, and then think about retirement. Thinking about, perhaps 26. I had been in 26 years. I was an SIS 4, which is equivalent at the time to about a 3-star general. I had been the division chief of my own division, Latin America division. I have been deputy in the Counter Narcotics Center. And for the first time, the agency did not have, when I got back from Mexico, they said, take your time, take all those hours that you have of home leave, and we will figure out where to place you. Well, 9/11 changed everything, totally changed everything.
And, I'm really glad you pointed out the SIS level. I mean, for us in the military, you've got the general officer ranks, and you just mentioned like SIS 4 is kind of the equivalent to the general officer, to a 3-star general. So you're operating with the same responsibilities that weight carries within DC and around the world. And I think a lot of people just don't understand that when they see the movies, which is their optic into the CIA. It's very much one person out on his own. So thank you for sharing that. As I was reading your book, as I was reading Hard Measures, you spend some time just talking about the path until you get to CTC, until 9/11 and that beginning portion of your career. And one of the things you said, no one would have pegged me as a future top US intel officer when I was growing up. And I was hoping we could start there, because I think your beginnings are such a great story compared to where you end up. If you could just share kind of how you grew up briefly, and then we'll jump into what that meant for your career.
Well, it's very interesting because when you say that you lived overseas and you liked living overseas and embassy life, I had a similar background. I was born in Puerto Rico, but pretty quickly, I was a toddler. My father took the family to Colombia. And, growing up in the third world during tumultuous times was one hell of an education for me. So we go to Colombia, and it's a country at war, civil war. There's genocide going on in the countryside. And we lived in a small town called Buga in the middle of the country. There's a picture of me, and you've probably seen it in Hard Measures, of me sitting on the milkman's horse. And, I've always loved horses. So whenever he'd come to deliver milk, my mother would ask if I would be able to sit on his horse. And there's a picture of me sitting there. My father's behind me. And later on, my parents found out that the milkman delivered milk during the day, but at night he was an insurgent. He was a guerrilla. So it's the type of danger that existed at the time. So different cities in Colombia, and then when I got ready to go to high school, we moved to Bolivia, and in Bolivia, again, there was a coup d'état. We could see the World War II airplanes diving to bomb the military headquarters from our house. Interesting times, and enjoyed a tremendous 1965. And in 1965, there was a civil war going on there. So the Dominican Republic, you had a number of military officers that rebelled. They were supported by Cuba, and they wanted to take over, and the US government intervened, sent the 82nd Airborne Division and the Marines, and the city was divided in two. The Marines put some barbed wire across the city, and at night you couldn't sleep unless you heard the gunfire going on. So interesting times. Enjoy living overseas. Enjoyed the culture, the history, everything about it, and including got a taste of embassy life because my father took a job with USAID. So I loved everything about it. So I went to I went to university, first time living in the US at 18 years old, came to the University of Florida and went straight through bachelor's and law school. But I didn't go to law school to practice law. I went to law school because I thought it would give me an advantage in trying to get a job in national security. And it did. And I applied to the agency like a lot of people do. And, just wrote it out and took 2 years of vetting. And finally, they said, you're in. You will come in for the class of starting in November of 1976. And that's a new world for me.
Well, let me ask you this. What was it like when you came to the US for the first time at the age of 18? I remember coming back to the US at 13 and never really having lived here. It was a bit of a shock to me. What was it like for you?
Well, one of the biggest shocks, of course, was that I was used to classes, high school being 15 students or 20 at the most, and here I was coming to university of 26,000 people, students. Being away from home for the first time, far away, but my parents lived in the Dominican Republic. Everything about it was new. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. The only thing that was familiar to me is going to church on Sunday. That was something familiar to me. I would do it just because I felt at home doing that. But, pretty quickly you adjust and you get on with it. I enjoyed big football, great football teams at the University of Florida at that time, and enjoyed my time in Gainesville.
What made you seek out the national security track? I mean, you mentioned getting your bachelor's and then law school so that you can kind of pursue that national security domain. Where did it come from for you?
Yeah, it came from living in Latin America and appreciating the history of all these places, and appreciating what was going on in the world. And I thought I could make a contribution and enjoy the life at the same time. So that's the only place I applied to, was the agency, and fortunately I got in. But yes,
Did you talk to your parents about that at all?
Excuse me?
Did you talk to your parents about that decision at all?
Yeah, my parents knew a couple people were from the agency, but they didn't know very much. They were in the AID, Agency for International Development, so they didn't know much about it, but they always basically told me to do what I needed to do, and and supported me the whole time. So they were not surprised.
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked in the book, you talk about these during the interview process, these two, I guess, former Cuban agency officers who are interviewing you in the process. And you mentioned that somehow you find out later that they went to bat for you. I think that's the term you used. Could you tell us just a little bit more about that? I found it very interesting because you didn't fit the mold.
Yes, that's interesting because I went through the process. They bring you in, they pay your way, you get a big interview one afternoon. Someone from the office, that recruits people, you have a 3 or 4 hour interview with them. Then they give you a bunch of tests, and at some point later on, you go away, you come back for a second interview, and this time they want you to talk to someone in operations. In this case, it was Cuban operations in the Latin American division. And they had 2 officers interview me. Both of them became good friends later on. And it was interesting because later on, much later on, when I think I was DDO, one of them said to me, look, we went to bat for you because at the time they weren't sure if they wanted to hire you, which was interesting because at the time there were not that many people with my background and my ethnicity coming into the agency, you know? So I found that very interesting. And as a matter of fact, when I became DDO later on, I was interested in reforming the recruitment process at the agency, because we talk a lot about recruiting people from different backgrounds, but then they have to pass all the tests and be able to speak English at the highest levels. And I remember when I was DDO and finding out at the last minute that 3 individuals from hard countries, hard targets, had flunked out at the last minute. So I called the people from the farm. I called them in. I says, what happened? What happened? Well, at the last minute, we recognized that they could not really write or at the agency level. And I said, you know what? Send them to the counterterrorism center. I can guarantee you within 3 months, they'll be able to write. And, you know, so it's the type of thing. And I actually talked to the chief of human resources. I says, do we need to break the system, you know, so that we can recruit more people from different places? Because, you know, half the time, you know, if you want people from different backgrounds, you're gonna have to make allowances. You're gonna have to make some trade-offs. You're gonna have to take some risks. And it takes a long time for security to clear people. And if they come from different countries, they have to get some information from those countries. And so it's not an easy thing to do. But I still think to this day that the agency in many cases misses the boat in going out and not pushing the envelope in recruiting people from different walks of life. And I think that's still an issue. But obviously, it was an issue when I came in, and fortunately, these 2 officers recognized that perhaps I should be part of the agency and went to bat for me. So it's interesting. Oh,
Can you speak at all, Jose, just because you had mentioned before there weren't a lot of people with your background and ethnicity. How challenging was it once you got your foot in the door, being the odd one out, for lack of a better term, being somebody who's different in this environment?
well, you know, I always was able to make friends everywhere, and I have a pretty good skills to communicate with people. And so personally, I had no issue. I mean, I made friends, you know, the career trainee program, spy school. You know, you become friends forever. You are, you know, 2 or 3 years together, you know, going through training. My own writing back then was not as good as it could be, but it became good eventually. So I adjusted pretty quickly, you know. So
Yeah,
you
and I
know,
think
in law school, when I was in law school at the University of Florida, you had the Alpine rooms, you know, where the professor sat at the bottom, and you had all the students, you know, much higher. And I remember the professor one time calling me, and I could feel my thick accent, you know, coming out as I tried to answer his thing. But all good.
yeah, you know, we should probably just spend a second for people who aren't familiar with the agency, how important writing is in that job. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, you've gone from the lowest level to the highest. How important is writing? How would you describe that to people? Because you don't see that in the movies either.
Because the reason why it's so important is because the one agency in government that I have seen that writes is the agency. We didn't call on the phone for the longest time. We didn't even have phone communications.
Yeah.
Later on, we got the PRT 250 that we could communicate via satellite to headquarters. But back then, you wrote. You went out to a meeting, you came back, you wrote the cables, you wrote the intel reports, and that's how you communicate. So it is important to be able to write clearly, concisely, and it is very important.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, CrayonEater Coffee, that you won't want to miss, and we'll get right back to this combat story. For those who have been downrange, you know that coffee is a critical component of any day. It's one of the few things to actually look forward to. And some of you know that I drink coffee for the first half, at least, of every interview, and it remains a key part of my day. We're proud to support CrayonEater Coffee, coming to you from, you guessed it, some former Marines, their families, and members of the law enforcement community. They know all too well what it takes, and the special people on both sides of the coin, downrange and at home, where we all know the family members that support us don't get enough credit. CrayonEater Coffee is 100% Arabica coffee, masterfully roasted from over 20 years of research and development, with unique flavor mixes that represent the craziness of our lives and the greatness of how the unique family blend can be. When CrayonEaters mix with coffee, something unique and incredible is bound to brew up. You can get yours now at CrayonEaterCoffee.com and use promo code CombatStory, all one word. So that's CrayonEaterCoffee.com. So CrayonEater Coffee.com. Use promo code Combat Story to get 10% off your purchase and start your colorful day off on a bright note with CrayonEater Coffee. And now back to this combat story.
Then I'd say just the one other, number one, I feel like being a law student gave you a serious leg up when it came to writing. So I'm sure that was helpful. The other acronym that we might just spend a minute unpacking for people is DDO. I, of course, know what that is. Could you just share the responsibility of that role? Because I know it's going to come up a few times here.
Yeah, the DDO is Deputy Director of Operations. Basically, you are the head of all spies, the human spying, which is the agency's main mission. And I kept saying that over the years, and not to denigrate the other directorates, but the reason the agency exists, in my humble opinion, is because of the human spying that we do, and we do so well. Now, when I was DO, actually, there was a movement to take the DO out of the agency and put it somewhere else. And I was against it, because we also rely on our scientists, the Science and Technology Directorate, to give us that technological edge. We've had it since the 50s, when we had the martini, the olive in the martini, the microphone in the martini, or we had the airplanes, the high altitude airplanes that collected intelligence. We've always had a technological edge. And then we've had the analysts, and the analysts, again, really, really capable people that put things into perspective for us. And actually later on, one of the biggest things that I did in my career, when I went to the Counter Narcotics Center, it was a center that was in the Directorate of Intelligence, now Analysis. And there were a lot of analysts that wanted to do operations. They didn't want to write any more papers. They got tired of it. And they became targeting analysts in the Counter Narcotics Center. And then when I became head of counterterrorism, I brought those people back to CTC, the Counterterrorism Center, and they made a huge impact. And the reason we were able to find all of these Al-Qaeda people was because we had people with the discipline and the smarts to be able to take information, big information, and boil it down to its main essence. So the Director of Operations, we are the spies, we are the people overseas, we are the people that go to stations overseas. I was the head of it. That means the head of all the world, all of the division chiefs, all of the case officers all over the world. It's a big job.
Huge job. Yeah. And we'll talk about kind of you moving into that role in a bit. But what I wanted to do was go back to horses, which you mentioned earlier, and the horse named Business. If you could share that, I found that to be really interesting.
Yeah, when I started, brand new case officer overseas, there was one issue that was a common thread for my first two overseas assignments, and that was horses, because the cavalry was in charge. There were military dictators in in Latin America, the whole southern cone, were military dictators, mostly cavalry officers. And I was a skilled rider. And I was able to get myself invited to ride in my first tour at this military installation. And the person who became the dictator of that country within 2 months used to command that unit. And when he became president, he went back to writing to that unit. So there were only 3 civilians there. The ambassador from Israel, the ambassador from Germany, and Jose Rodriguez, third secretary of the embassy. So I loved it. It gave me a reason to get to work late every morning. I mean, I would get up very early and jump in my car and go and ride, and the president would arrive and we would all ride together. And it was not that I collected great intelligence, I mean, at that level, but I rode with the president and his main people, the Minister of Interior and the Chief of Intelligence, But I remember receiving a cable from headquarters asking the station, hey, we have sensitive information that the president may be sick, may be having some disease of some sort. So it gave me great pleasure to be able to say, this officer rode with the president this morning. His cheeks were rosy. He was energetic. We jumped obstacles on the outside, and he was in good shape and didn't look like he was suffering from anything at all. So on my second tour, I went to a country that I had lived as a kid, as a teenager, and a captain in the Army became my riding instructor. 17 years later, I go back. It took me a while to recognize he was the same guy who was now the dictator.
Wow.
Gone from a svelte, athletic guy to being overweight with a bunch of medals. And he was the first narco dictator. So I went to see him and asked for permission. I told him, look, you were I was a child, I was a young person, so you don't recognize me, but you used to give me writing instructions. At the time, the embassy had a charge d'affaires. They had removed the ambassador because they were critical of the narco trafficking that was being carried out by this dictator. And of course, the dictator said, of course, yeah, you can come ride. So we would ride all the time. It was interesting because they had Argentine majors that were instructing the senior equestrian class at the cadet school, at the military academy. And I would ride with them. I would ask permission to ride with them, and I would ride with them. And one time I was riding with the president, with the dictator. We were jumping adobe walls, and his horse stumbled, and he fell to the ground. And we didn't know at the time he broke his leg, and he was on the ground screaming with pain. We had a cadet with us. I sent him back to get a vehicle, and I stayed with him until the vehicle came. And that afternoon, my wife and I went to see him at the hospital. Well, I was in like Flint. After that, he invited me to come to the lunches with his top people, ride, and then have a barbecue at the stables, drink beer. And pretty quickly they would forget I was from the American embassy. So it was very good for my career. But horses have been a big part of my life, and a lot of my early tours were very helpful in my career.
Yeah, just a couple things there. You did name one of them business, right? One of the horses you just referred to as business. Why was that again?
So that I could go in the middle of the afternoon and tell my colleagues, if the COS asks for me, tell them I'm out on business. Okay, so it worked like a charm.
That's great, and I think it's worth noting that as you described, kind of being the third secretary with two ambassadors, the chief of staff, the head of the country. The
Yeah,
third secretary is like the lowest form of humanity on the
exactly.
diplomatic circuit. You may as well be like a first lieutenant or maybe even like a private for the military folks who are listening. So
Well,
that
the
is
interesting thing, and
exceptional.
you're right, but I was a legitimate writer and I legitimately liked it. So they saw that and I could ride with them. I could jump with them. I could do anything with them. As a matter of fact, the ambassadors, whenever they would leave the country, they would ask me if I would ride their horses because they knew I would ride them and take care of them. And, you know, they were happy. And then they would invite me to their parties too. And somebody would say, how you're invited to the German ambassador's residence? How come? You know, well, it all came from riding horses.
Yeah, couple things here. I'm trying to imagine in the station when you talk about this with people, they're probably like, oh my gosh, Jose's just going to these incredible receptions. He's in with everyone.
Yeah.
If we kind of look at that, how would you describe that relationship amongst the case officers within a station? And not just not naming names or specifics, but just in general, what's that relationship like for people who've never felt that?
You know, law school is like spy school in some ways, in that they give you the background, the basics. Okay, you really learn your trade from your colleagues, your supervisors, but your colleagues in particular, case officers that have a couple of tours more than you do, and you go and ask them a question about your cases or get some advice from them. They are a key to all of this. So you rely on them a lot for guidance and knowledge and experience. It's a small service. If you look at it, we all know each other, and especially in the divisions. But as you go up the ranks and take jobs outside the division, like I did with counter narcotics and counterterrorism, and then of course BDO, you basically get to know most people, and they know you. The good part about it is that you have friends and they know you and they trust you and they know you. The bad thing about it is that sometimes you've got to make decisions regarding their career. And in some cases, if they get into trouble, it's harder to make a decision about them, especially if you have to remove them, which I had to do from their positions, especially if they're senior. I had to do that a couple of times, and believe me, that was one of the toughest things I had to do.
Yeah. I mean, that's somebody, I mean, you're close with, you may have gone through training with, you're in the room with them all day, you're at the office, you're talking about complicated ops. I can't imagine having to make that call.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Where you mentioned how important writing was. Why did you end up picking that up when you were growing up? What was the impetus to be a good writer?
I don't know. I liked it. I liked it ever since the Milkman in Colombia as a toddler. And then when I lived in Colombia, my father bought me a horse. Well, me and my brother and my sister, we share the horse. And then later on in Bolivia, we got another horse. So we grew up riding. And I had the good fortune when I entered the agency that for the first 5 years, I wrote every day, except Mondays. I wrote every day. And I loved it. I genuinely loved it. So for me, it was like, man, I can't believe they pay me for this, you know.
Why didn't you write on Mondays?
Well, Mondays was a day off for everybody, you know. So the people who took care of the horses and everybody took a break. But, you know, you wrote Tuesday through Sunday every day, and it was great, wonderful.
That's funny. Yeah, it was
Now,
probably when you
later,
wrote up
when
while
I
you were taking
became
traffic.
later on, and I left, you can do that in certain countries in Latin America. But then, when I went to El Salvador, for example, there's no writing there, and in other places there was no writing. But I early on, it was key to my career.
Yeah. And I was just going to mention, you brought up El Salvador. One of the things I remember from the book, I believe you lose an officer in El Salvador, yes, if I'm correct. Probably a lot of people who listen, they've heard about the stars on the wall at headquarters, probably seen it in a movie. but they're used to listening to combat vets who are downrange. They probably don't think of losing an agency officer this way. Could you just speak to that, like the relationship you had and what happened there?
Yeah, El Salvador was tough, but it was tough more than anything else because we lost a lot of people. And most of the time it was just accidents, airplanes running into mountains or helicopters dropping from the air. But the one case that I remember very clearly, it was this young officer. He'd been in the military, came right out of the military, and he sat outside my office waiting for the doctor to see him. He had a stomach issue in El Salvador. So I had a chance to talk to him at length and got to know him a lot better. I was getting ready to come to the US for the birth of my second son. And I get a call about 3 a.m. from our air ops person to say that our helicopter with this young officer was missing. And of course, I said, okay, let's go to the station. Let's go to the embassy. And we got there, and I woke up the COS, and we all met in the office. And a decision was made. I would stay behind, and I would deal with Washington, and tell them what happened, and tell them to. Pretty quickly, the COS went out, and they found the wreckage. And we were able to identify our officer because he had very distinctive boots and he had a red beard. So we found, some of that. And it was just horrible. I mean, horrible. I mean, give me any flap in the world. Give me a special prosecutor investigating me. It doesn't compare with losing people in mission. And, that was hard. When I got ready to retire, I invited my family to have lunch with me in my office at the agency. And the first thing is I took my boy that was born, that I was supposed to come to the birth for, and I showed him in the book the name of the officer and the date. And I said, that's why I was not at your birth, because of this officer that died here. And that meant a lot. It's hard losing people and across the board, it's really hard.
And the book that you're referencing is, of course, the book that sits below the stars on the wall there with the names of those who can be named. Some of them still cannot because of what the service that they provided. That's pretty special. I suppose one of the things that I was curious about is you talked about at such a young age in your career was becoming a chief of station. What was it like in that first chief of station role for you? Like, what was the pressure? How did you feel about going into that role?
I had a good mentor, chief of station in Bolivia. Was just a great teacher and great mentor for me before I got to my COS job. And I had a couple of really incredible human beings, mentors of mine who helped me and who I admired and who I said to myself, I remember the first one is, the last thing I ever wanted was to disappoint him. I would be meticulous. I would work my butt off because I never wanted to disappoint. And then I thought to myself, can you imagine if you have everybody in a station or in a component that don't want to disappoint their boss, and therefore they do the best they can to. Is that right? Yes. Yes, I had a very special mentor early on in my career, and the last thing I ever wanted to do was to disappoint him at all. I wanted to do the best I could, be careful with my operations and the people that I handle, the agents that I handle, because I did not want to disappoint him. And I thought to myself later on, I said, man, that was so inspiring that if I can do that. If people can admire me and can respect me to the point where they don't want to disappoint me, how powerful is that, you know? And the second mentor was also very interesting guy. He said to me, "Don't take this too seriously. You know, I mean, look at the positive aspects of everything." He again was also incredible. So I had early on very, very good mentors that gave me an idea of how I wanted to run my stations. My first station, small, I was me and another case officer and a third person, and that was it. Um, you know, I did the best I could. I learned a lot from that experience. I was fortunate. I was lucky. I got some good results. I didn't make big mistakes, which could happen. And then I went to El Salvador and I was the chief of liaison, and a liaison was 95% of the work we did. Big, I had people, you know, big station. I had a lot of people working for me, and many of them were deployed in the brigades. And we had a chief COS that was really, you know, everybody should have a couple of bad bosses. And I tell my kids that, I say, because you learn a lot from those experiences. What I learned after dealing with this one chief of station in El Salvador was that I could work for the devil incarnate himself and figure out how to deal with it, you know. So there's always, and I always tell young officers, look, nobody wants to be in a difficult situation where you have a boss that you don't respect. But the good thing about the agency is that 2 years down the road, you will go on to something else. So it's temporary. It's not like you're going to live your whole life under the thumb of this individual, you know, and deal with it, figure it out. You know, I tell my kids that all the time. He said, you know, deal with it, because you're going to find in life that you're going to have to deal with difficult people. You're going to have to deal with difficult bosses. You're going to have to deal with, and you're going to have to figure out how to do it. So those are big lessons to be learned. And early on, I had a chance to learn that from my own experience.
You know, actually, before I ask this next question, I am curious whatever it was that mentor did that inspired you and that you tried to use, what are some of those traits or tactics that you ended up using to try to inspire people in that way?
First,
because clearly it worked. So, yeah.
First, I mean, you don't have to be a hard ass to get your point across. Okay. You don't have to raise your voice. You don't have to be a dictator. You can get your point across if you know what you're doing, and if you respect the people, and if you protect the people who work for you. I mean, that was another big lesson I learned early on, is you owe it to your troops to help them, to protect them, to do everything that you can to make them succeed, because in them succeeding, you succeed. There were a lot of people at the ages, not a lot, but there were some who wanted to take all the credit, especially chiefs of station. I never wanted to do that, because I figure if my station succeeds and we do what we are to, the credit comes to me as their boss. So that was another lesson learned from that.
I feel like people just don't, it's odd. It seems so common sense that if the people do well, it makes you look good as the boss, but man, not everybody sees it, I suppose.
Okay. We can talk about some of these things when we come to the counterterror, being the head of the counterterror.
Yeah.
You
know, I suppose in the pre-CTC part of your career, Jose, one of the things that I ask all of the interviewees that I sit with here on Combat Story is if they could take me to the first time that they found themselves in the combat environment. And I think the way that translates over to the agency is maybe the first time you remember doing like a challenging operational act. And obviously we can't talk about what it is, but just the mindset that's involved. If you could kind of share a little bit of, I mean, you're on your own as opposed to the military going out with a team. Just if you could speak a little bit to that with how young you are at the time when you're doing those acts.
Well, first tour, I was given one of the more sensitive agents, which for us, we call agents are informants, but it's a much more important relationship, a much more formal relationship that you have than, let's say, a law enforcement informant. You know, these are people that we polygraph, that we vet, that we support, that we treat them, you know, sometimes like family. I mean, we support them. If their family gets sick, you try to help them out. I mean, incredible what we do for the people who work for us. I was assigned one of the most important agents, a local penetration, and I mean, I was sweating bullets because, man, I mean, this would be horrible. And I spent a lot of time thinking about my meetings and where I was going to meet him and what I was going to do, and rehearsing if we ever got spotted by someone, what I would do. It's only when you are in that situation that you understand. Well, first of all, I mean, you are also working on behalf of the U.S. government, you know, so whatever you do, if you screw up, I mean, it's the USG that is, you know, involved in this thing too, you know. So I had a number of those agents like that. I had a lot of those agents in war zones. So throughout my career, especially unilaterally, when I was doing that and meeting people in the street and making sure that my operations were tight and that there was not going to be any flap because of me, it takes a toll. I mean, sometimes I would think about it at night, saying, "Well, this is something." But
Because if that goes wrong, yeah, like it's on you. There's nobody else there, and it's an international incident if it goes wrong.
Yeah. And of course, later on, we can talk about some of the specific things. Early on, of course, the agency, when I wrote the book, that didn't allow me to say much about the first 3 tours of duty because they were unilateral tours. Later on, El Salvador, Panama, Mexico, they had no problem with me because I was declared, I was the chief of station. And of course, when I became a DO, and there's a number of operations there that were interesting.
Yeah, and I think we will, you know, I'd love to hear some of the more challenging ops that you found yourself a part of. But I think it would be great. You mentioned Mexico City. As far as I know, you know, I didn't serve in Latin America division, but huge station for Latin America, obviously. So many people, such an important relationship with the US, have to get it right to be at that part in your career, at that point. And then as you shift into CTC or counter narcotics, but then CTC, what is the feeling like for you as you go into CTC that first time?
First of all, it was a surprise. Well, no, it was not a surprise. I mean, it was a surprise when I became the head of the Counterterrorism Center, to be perfectly honest. But after 9/11, the agency was looking for its best officers across the board, over the agency. And they basically said, "You're going to the Counterterrorism Center, and you're going there to support Cofer Black, who was a CT classmate of mine." So I knew him from spy school.
Wow.
My wife and I were unpacking our belongings at our house when 9/11 happened. And a neighbor of ours called and said, "Hey, what put on the TV? We're being attacked." Of course, we didn't unpack. We sat there in front of the TV. And I knew we were going to war. Sure enough, a few days later, I get called in and said, "You're going to the Counterterrorism Center. You're going to go help Cofer Black out." And you know, at the agency, many times it's pretty informal. There was no letter of instruction telling you exactly what your duties were going to be. Just go help them out. Okay. At the time, as I said, I was an SIS 4. I had been at the agency for 26 years. I had run big stations, big components. And I get there, and the director of the Counterterrorism Center is overseas most of the time, lining up our allies to go into Afghanistan. And the deputy spent all day downtown at the White House, at the Pentagon, at the FBI, in the community. So I was the next ranking guy. All of the titles that the agency had, like group chief and branch chief, I mean, this was bigger, and all those titles were taken. So I gave myself a title, gave the chief operating officer, which doesn't exist in the agency. I had a copy machine taken out of a little closet-like room that became my office. And pretty quickly, the Counterterrorism Center was overwhelmed because overnight, we went from 150 people or so to over 1,000 overnight. And the budget was over $1 billion. And we had one budget officer. We had one person answering the mail for not only the agency, but everywhere. We had people that we didn't have space for them. So I became, with George Tennants and other senior people, to support the mission, support our mission to go into Afghanistan. I did that for a number of months. And my surprise was that by May of 2002, George Tennant selected me to become the head of it. Now, why was that a surprise? Well, because here is Jose Rodriguez, no experience working in Africa or any division, the Middle East division, becoming the head of the Counterterrorism Center. I think a lot of people were wondering, well, who the hell is this guy? Although they had gotten to know me for the first 8 or 9 months at the Counterterrorism Center. But it was still a big deal. And in the book, you see that the Counterterrorism Center was, for me, an incredible experience. First of all, I felt honored to be part of the team that was going to respond to the 9/11 attacks. I would have done whatever they would, mop the floors, I would have been there. So I just felt very fortunate. And we had all these people right in the agency, like a dentist saying, you need to inflict pain on somebody, bring me in, I can do that for you. And we had all these people, wanting to be put into the mission. We had a lot of people who had retired, came back, wanting to come back in. So I felt privileged to be there at the time, even though, my first meeting in the morning was at 7:30, prepare for the 7:30, I was there at 6:30. I then forced everyone, the senior people in the Counterterrorism Center, to hear me out, to hear what was going on in the 7th floor. And my day started then. Would not end till I tried to, on my way home, stop at the gym, but half the time I'd be laying on the bench like this, exhausted, But it was very special. And it was very special because our 90 people who went in 2 weeks after 9/11 infiltrated into North Pakistan, Afghanistan, to coordinate and liaise with the Northern Alliance, made a huge difference. We welcomed special forces a week or two later, and together with the firepower of our Air Force, within 3 months, there was a rout. The Al-Qaeda had got into Tora Bora and on to different places in the Middle East. And we then had to restructure the Counterterrorism Center again. When I became the head of it, one of the first things I did was restructure the place with the help of really good people. And that's another thing I want to say here. I had some of the best people from the agency, some of them women. Gina Haspel, I recruited her, brought her, and I told her, you're not going back to where you came from, you're staying with me.
And for those who don't know, Gina goes on to be the director of the agency.
Became director of the agency. I know the one, and I don't know if she would want me to tell her name, but I had met her in the Counter Narcotics Center, and I asked her to come and help me administratively to reorganize the place. And the targeters were all women, and they would come and brief me in my office, and I would tell them, I am glad that I'm on your side, because if I was bin Laden or some of his people, I would be extremely concerned that you all were going to come after me, hearing what I had. So it was an incredible team of people, and we had to reorganize it. And if you want to, I can get into that, but it's a long story.
Yeah. No, I would like you to. And I would even just say for people who are listening, like I was the beneficiary of what you did in those years, because I came in later and I didn't work in CTC at headquarters, but in the field where I worked, we were supporting CTC's mission regularly. And the fact, I didn't realize what a hand that you had in breaking down the walls between the DO and the DI, or whatever, the DA now. I mean, some of the strongest people we worked with were having the analysts right next to us. They were so deep into the subject matter. They knew exactly who to go after. We knew the tradecraft side. They knew what to do with the info. So I would just say, like, when you're talking about restructuring, when I came into the building, like CTC had a beautiful, like the office space was there. I'm sure when you were there, you're talking about moving copying machines to just find an office. So yeah, please take us through it.
Well, we were all crowded in the basement. It was not a basement, but there were no windows there. I mean, and our two conference rooms, the big one was taken over by people who needed to be there to do the targeting work. And we had a little place where we would all jump in there and work together. But we recognized that the conflict had changed, and that it had to go from a paramilitary approach with our people deployed into Afghanistan to support the effort to drive the Taliban and Al-Qaeda out, to one where intelligence collection became the most important factor in going one at a time after each one of the senior Al-Qaeda, the leadership of Al-Qaeda, okay? We had to go find them. And to do that, we had to restructure CTC. And to do that, one of the first things I did, like back then, only DO people had access to the counterterrorism database. So I said, well, how can we have all of these other people that are integrated? I mean, we were under the same umbrella, but we have the analysts here, we have the operators here, we got some of the people who came from different agencies over here. And I said, no, if you have a green badge. So, there was a lot of controversy giving access to our database. So my second chief of ops, I called him, and he had been chief of station in Moscow. And those are hard ass guys, I mean, they are so secure, man. They won't tell grandmothers, they will tell them. I said, then what do you think if I give access to everybody that works here with a badge? And he says, you got to do it. That convinced me. I said, okay, overnight, we gave everybody access, which made a big difference because people feel that they're part of the one team. Okay?
And Jose, I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to underscore, like, you broke with decades of precedence in doing that, right? I mean, you're talking about anyone with a badge. I know what you mean by that, but like you're talking about contractors, but not just that. You're also talking about ops and analysts who used to have separate cafeterias at one point.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we're looking at the same database, which sounds common sense, but it was not self-evident. No.
Back then, it was not the way that things worked. And there were a lot of people, especially people who'd been there for a long time, who'd never, it was heresy to do that. But we figured we had to do it.
Just a quick word from one of our sponsors, and we'll get right back to the show. This is a unique one for us on Combat Story, as we're highlighting the Mr. Ballin podcast, hosted by fellow veteran and former Navy SEAL John Ballin, that focuses on telling dark and mysterious stories. For example, there's a teen solo hiker who is terrorized for days by unknown figures dressed in white. In another story, 2 cops quit their job at a local theater because of unexplained encounters with an alleged demon. An isolated forest in Canada where people keep turning up headless. These are just some of the strange, dark, and mysterious stories you'll hear each week on the Mr. Ballin podcast. In each episode, Mr. Ballin shares real-life haunting accounts, like the case of Haley Zaga, who disappeared from a hiking trail for 51 hours. So, hey, Prime members, listen to the Amazon Music exclusive podcast, Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories in the Amazon Music app. Download the app today. And now, back to this combat story.
So, over the summer months, one of the things we had to do at our lunch time, we take our sandwich to the conference room and we talk about how we're going to reorganize the Counterterrorism Center. And I had more deputies than you would ever think. I had a analyst deputy. I had a brigadier general deputy. I had a FBI deputy. I mean, I was surrounded by deputies. So we would go into the conference room and we would talk about how we're going to reorganize the Counterterrorism Center. And we came up, we didn't pay any contractors to do this. We did it ourselves, okay? And one of the things that we immediately came upon was, okay, well, so we're going to put DODI together in the different units. What are we going to call those units? Well, they were not groups. They were much bigger than groups. I said, let's call them departments. To this day, the mission centers have departments. It comes from us.
That's funny. I did not know that.
Through back in 2002, trying to figure out how we're going to do this. So we reorganized and we had people from the different, from DI, DO, S&T become heads of those departments. I made incredible friends with people from across the agency because I had them all there. We welcomed people from other agencies that came in because they all wanted to come in after they figured we were the mission managers for this. They wanted to send their people and we welcomed them and they became part of the team. And it's interesting because years later, I got a green badge, to go into the agency. I can tell you, I never look at people's badges when I was the head of the Counterterrorism Center. I never did. They were there. They had been approved to come in. They were part of the team. So I think that was a big deal. But the biggest deal of all was that we were under tremendous threat. In May of 2002, we were facing huge threats. We knew that Al-Qaeda was coming back us in a second wave of attacks. And as with 9/11, we knew they were coming, but we didn't know when, where, how. And as with 9/11, if you don't know the particulars of when, where, how they're going to do this, or at least have a good idea, it's worthless. You can tell the president they're coming at us, but you don't know anything else. We were under the gun to get specific intelligence on Al-Qaeda's plans and intentions. We knew that Al-Qaeda had been able to do, they were talking to Pakistani scientists about some type of nuclear radiological device that they could use to put in a US city. And we found when we went into Afghanistan, we found the sketches of what their discussions with A.Q. Khan, who was, I don't know if you know the story of A.Q. Khan, but I mean, he was very much involved in talking to the scientists. He was a scientist himself and talking to them how they could do one of these devices. And for me, one of the scariest things is not that complicated. You think this is complicated stuff. It's not that complicated. And we knew that Al-Qaeda had developed anthrax at their lab in Turnock Farms and that they intended to use it against us. So we were facing serious threats, okay? Now, this is what happened. In March of 2002, we captured Abu Zubaydah. Abu Zubaydah was the highest ranking Al-Qaeda senior that had ever been in our custody. We captured him through really hard, a lot of it was human work, but there were other things that helped us. And we were able to capture him. And he was wounded in the capture. So we had to make a decision what to do, where to care for him. And so we decided to take him away from Pakistan and put him in a place where we could have total control of him, away from the public light, where we could bring the best medical care in the world to help him out. And we did. And he became a black site, the first black site. Abu Zubaydah gave us some early pieces of information, a couple of pieces of information. One of them, he confirmed that the chief of operations for Al-Qaeda was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which was big because we didn't know if Abu Zubaydah or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but we knew that one of the two because we had a lot of information out there. The other, he said, we have dispatched a person who is going to detonate some type of weapon of mass destruction in your homeland. So imagine, we were all, except that was all he gave. He gave us enough where we were able to, and he said his name or his nom de guerre is Abu al-American, Abu the American, right? But we were able to find him. We were able to find him. His name is Jose Padilla. He was in Egypt. We followed him to Egypt. We followed him to Zurich. And from there, we followed him to Chicago, where we had given information to the FBI. And they were able to capture him, and he was tried and convicted and serving time in federal prison. What he had been given money by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to rent apartments in different cities in the US that use natural gas. And they would use natural gas to blow apartments in different cities, again, simultaneously as Al-Qaeda used to do things, you know. But once Abu Zubaydah started to regain his health, he stopped talking. And we were pounded. At 5 o'clock, George Tenet was asking me, what are we learning about future attacks? We didn't have any. The president was kicking the shit out of George Tenet in the briefings, you know. So we had to do something different. We had this most senior Al-Qaeda leader ever in our custody. We knew he knew a lot. We knew it because he had come across a screen for the 2000, you know, attacks that they were supposed to do in Jordan. And then we captured someone he had dispatched to Canada to come across the border and put a bomb at LAX. I'm talking about 2000, the year 2000 or something like that. Yeah, 2000, the turn of the century. So we knew we had to do something different. So we asked our black site to put Abu Zubaydah in isolation, and I brought everybody back to headquarters, talk about what we could do. And over the summer months of 2002, we came up with what became the Enhanced Interrogation Program, which became very controversial, but which created tremendous intelligence for us that allowed us not just to learn everything about Al-Qaeda that we didn't know, like their logistics, their finances, their operations, their training, their leadership, their plans, but we also use the intelligence to go after senior levels. And within a few years, we basically either had captured them and they're awaiting trial in Guantanamo, or killed them with our Predator strikes.
You mentioned, Jose, that it took time. Very controversial is almost an understatement, and you know that better than anyone because you've been kind of on the front lines for this. It doesn't seem like it was just one decision, right? It took time, but could you have foreseen the challenges that this thing ended up creating down the road? Like you could see that coming?
Look, I had been at the agency for 26, 27 years, okay? I had been left holding the bag after the Central American wars. And I had seen myself, but in many cases, colleagues of mine, chiefs of station, taken to the cleaners after the Central American wars by the new administration that came in. And it was payback time, and it was time to investigate. It was time to punish people. So I think all of us recognize that eventually the goalpost may be moved. And because of that, because of the controversial nature of what we were going to do, that there was a chance that we would have to pay, be investigated by the IG or worse. But we assumed the risk. And I tell the story because in my case, maybe I'm just a simple-minded guy, but for me, it was pretty easy. I mean, they were coming after us. The Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department and our own lawyers said it was legal. And we needed it, and we needed it quick. So that's all the analysis I could have. My deputy was an analyst, and he researched books, and he researched, and he talked to people, and eventually he arrived at the same decision I had, but very well thought out. Really deep analysis. Everybody had to do that, okay, for themselves, because if they didn't feel comfortable, they could go somewhere else. And most people think, look, I'm being called by my country to do this. I'm not going to wimp out at this moment. There were some, but most of them said, we'll take this on. And I'm telling you, man, there's a lot of people who suffered tremendously later on because they were investigated, and they were investigated time and time again, which is a shame. It's a shame that we put our people through this when they tell you to go do something like this and protect us. And then once you do that, then, the goalposts change. But as I say in Hard Measures, I have no regrets whatsoever. I would do it again, even though I was investigated for 3 years by a special prosecutor. And if you never investigated by a special prosecutor, you want to avoid it at all costs.
How many gray hairs did that cost you?
Well, I tell you, it's interesting because I don't understand. I was pretty confident. Before I left the agency. I went into transition. I was able to read the record, and I knew that if there was any fairness in the system, that we would be exonerated because we did everything by the book. Okay, we got approval. We got a binding legal opinion from the Justice Department. Okay. Every time that somebody like the IG would investigate, said, you waterboarded them too many times, we would stop, go back to Justice Department. Are we out of line here? They would come back officially and said no, and we would continue. And then somebody else would say something, and we would stop, and we would go back and ask. We did that until 2005, when finally they were going to change the legal basis, which meant that the people who worked for me would then be in legal problems. So that's when we stopped it.
And I encourage people to read Hard Measures, and there's a part in there, I think it's with Abu Zubaydah, where after these techniques, he opens up, as you described. He almost has respect for like, all right, now I'm gonna. He almost becomes close to us with his handlers at the time, sharing what's going on as a result of these. So it's a shame, I think, that because of the secretive nature of everything that we do, you don't really get to hear the nuggets that necessarily came out and led to some of the captures down the road. But I'm again, like at the beginning, that's why I said, just a thank you from so many of us who relied on that decision that you had to make and shoulder.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly right. But it was something we had to do, and we did it, and we're proud of it. It made a difference. And I keep saying, because you continue to hear this, okay, you continue to say, well, no good information was obtained.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I keep saying, declassify the 3,000 or so many intelligence reports that we obtain that come from the enhanced interrogation program, and historians will get a chance to evaluate the value of this program. Of course, the government can't do it, won't do it. They have the Guantanamo trials. The prosecutors are afraid, even though there's, we don't have to protect any equities here. They are in jail. They're in Guantanamo awaiting trial. But the biggest thing is that when the time comes and they declassify all the intelligence that was obtained from all the different people that we captured, I mean, I could go through some of the people that we captured. I think that people will recognize, and by that time, who knows when it will be, and people will forget about it, and they will know about it, and even historians in the press, nobody will pay attention to it. That's the way it is.
I was hoping we could talk about two people also, Jose, that I know the names of. I definitely saw Jennifer Matthews in the book.
Yes.
And the other is Mike Spann. First casualty in that war with Afghanistan. When we go into Afghanistan, CIA officer. You were at CTC at the time. I think it was December of 2001. Do you remember that incident with Mike Spann at all?
Of course I remember it. Of course I remember it. I mean, it was it was just awful. I mean, and I don't know if you know this story. His wife was in California at the time, driving down the road when she heard on the radio news that, the first American CIA casualty. And so she called Hank Crumpton, who was our head of the special activities division, whatever you called it then. And he had to fess up to her that it was Mike Spann. I had a chance to talk to the officer who was with him and was able to get out. I'm not at liberty to divulge his name without asking him. But he emptied his gun and was able to get out, and Mike Spann wasn't. Yeah, again, the worst thing that any leader has to deal with is the death of his people, and then dealing with the family, and dealing with the wife, and dealing with the kids. It's just heartbreaking.
I was a senior at Georgetown at the time in DC, and I went to Mike Spann's funeral. I didn't know him. I just saw something posted in the Washington Post that they were going to have it, and I showed up. There were a lot of people there, former military folks, because I believe he was a Marine previous to that, and then presumably some agency people there, just obviously no uniforms. And I just remember thinking like, oh my God, I can't wait to get into this fight. I can't believe I'm standing here watching this funeral while this is raging in the background. So I was curious what it was like for you. And the other one is Jennifer, who you mentioned, I think, being a part of the Counterterrorism Center early on. And then, of course, I was just hoping if you're comfortable talking about it,
of course
obviously
I can.
A very tragic incident in 2009, if you could speak to your experience with that.
Well,
and maybe just who she is, if you could share.
Jennifer was a targeter. Talk about targeter. She was the head targeter. She was pregnant at the time. She was coming from down 95 somewhere. I mean, I don't know how long it took her to come to work. I don't know how long it took her to get home. Sometimes she would just stay with someone that she knew, a girlfriend of hers, so that she would just not have to go home. But she was quality, just a great human being. And I became very close with her because she would brief me all the time about the progress that we were making in going after some of these people. I have had the honor, and my book, if you look at the book, part of the proceeds from the book, and I've been giving parts of the proceeds for the past 11 years, goes to the agency foundation to support the families, but the kids in particular, of people who we've lost in overseas in mission-related killings, And I've had a chance to see Jennifer's kids grow. I just saw them last October when we had the last dinner. They're all grown up. They're in college. They've retired. They have graduated. I defended Jennifer tremendously. I don't know. There was a HBO special and about Jennifer. And they were trying to blame her for not knowing what she was doing, which is the most ridiculous thing that could ever be said. And people were trying to blame other people for the mistake that was made in allowing this terrorist to come in and blow himself up.
And this is the coast bombing. Just
And I said at the time, I said, look, first of all, there was a chief of station in that office, in that country. Then there was a chief of the division, there was a chief of CTC, there was a DDO, and there was a director of the Central Intelligence. Don't blame Jennifer for this, because everybody was under the gun to get intelligence, and nobody objected to her meeting this person. So I have met a lot of the children and spouses. In some cases, we help the spouses because they needed to finish their degree, so they could get a better job. So it's a very, very good cause. The agency foundation dinner is incredible. So I've seen the kids, and I've talked to the kids, and I've seen them grow and flourish, notwithstanding the tragic death. In this case of her, I went to the funeral of Jennifer. I mean, there was an 8-year-old boy, and the girl, the oldest, was like 11 or 12 or something like that. It was just very tragic, very tragic.
I will say one thing I've noticed, having been in both the military and the agency, people are very keen to thank me for my service in the military, but they're very quick. They won't say it to my face, but just online, I've noticed this with my podcast, that there's a lot of animosity for the fact that I worked at the agency. And to me, those worlds, the military and the agency, are very similar. I mean, Jennifer's life was taken in Coast. That's where I was based with the military. When I was in Afghanistan, I was at Salerno, right down the road from that. And that's part of the reason I want to share more of the experience of someone like yourself who's in that world for so long. Like, this is the loss of a colleague in a war zone. Yeah. This is a kid who's going to grow up without a mom. Just like all the soldiers we talk about who left behind families. It's a spouse, like Mike Spann's spouse, driving down the road, finding out what happened. These worlds aren't that different. Like, it's a lot of people who get paid very poorly to sacrifice a tremendous amount for people they're never going to meet. So I don't know. That's more of a public service announcement from Ryan, me on my soapbox, but it's important.
We lost another person. Again, I don't think I can tell his name. He was a training accident, and he had just gotten into the country and was being trained, and hand grenade went off and killed him. And I'm driving to work, and I'm told, the news. So I get to work, and that week, then we had to go to Andrews to wait for the body, meet the family, go see the wife first, go tell the wife in person, meet the family, do a memorial service, which I presided over. After a week, it was just like total emotional wreck. It just going through that, really hard, really hard.
I recently
Tell you
found
something. Oh,
I re-interviewed a former Marine special operator who was then in Delta Force, a fantastic human being. He's retired. And I asked him, after 25 years of service, the majority of it post 9/11 in the most elite units, what was the hardest thing you ever had to do? And he was breaking down, telling me about having to go to the house of the spouse and just say, your husband's not coming home. Just said it was the hardest thing ever that he had to do.
yeah, I totally agree. In my career, I don't give a shit about the special prosecutor, but having people die, forget it.
It's the worst.
Yeah.
I'll let you out of here soon, Jose. I promise.
I'm
Just a couple
here
more
as long as you
questions.
want.
Okay, thank you. There are a few other areas that I wanted to talk about, but you had mentioned earlier, because of the, unfortunately, the special prosecutor and the declassification of some of the operations, just to give people some insight into how challenging, thorny, complicated some of those operations could be. Are there one or two that come to mind that you're able to talk about, even at a high level, that you would just share to share some of the complexity of what an agency officer deals with in making something happen?
Well, see, in my case, counterterrorism, I was the head of it, and then in the DD, as a DDO, I was the head of it. But there are a number of things, in the book, I talk about going with General Hayden to Pakistan. His first trip to meet with Kayani, General Kayani, the head of Pakistani intelligence. We had been following this operation that the British were doing in the UK. They had discovered this cell of Al-Qaeda. They were getting ready to blow up to 10 airplanes flying from Heathrow to different points in the US and Canada using liquid explosives. The Brits had done an incredible job in getting the intelligence, and then they were able to gather information from breaking into their safe house and seeing what they were going to do. They were going to take soft drinks, plastic, like a bottle of water, but take the contents and put hydrogen dioxide in there. And they had a whole thing to blow up these airplanes simultaneously as they flew between the hours of 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. to different points in the US and Canada. So we were following, and the Brits said to us, look, we don't have any reach into the tribal area. You guys do. But the principal leader of this cell is in the tribal area. They get their instructions from him. Why don't you help us and find him and capture him? Of course, we got to it. While in Pakistan, I told Hayden that I was going to stay in Pakistan. I was not going to go to him for the next stop because I saw an opportunity to fly and visit our folks along the border, with Afghanistan. Because every time I went to Pakistan, the weather was bad and you couldn't fly out there. So there was a chance for me to go out there and see how they were doing. So I said to him, I'm staying. And we had a wonderful day out there visiting everybody. On the way back, when we landed, the deputy chief of station was waiting for us with the new intelligence, the most recent intelligence. The most recent intelligence was that they had selected the flights that were going to blow up. And I said to myself, this is going to happen. Okay? This is going to happen. This is imminent. Right away, within half an hour, I was informed that General Kayani wanted to see me and the chief of station that evening at his house.
What year is this, Jose? Just for people for
This
context.
is 2006. 2006. Okay. The intelligence also showed that this individual, his name is Rashid Rauf, was traveling from point A to point B in the tribal area, and there was going to be a stop in between a police checkpoint. So Kayani says to me, look, we've been working, we're partners in this operation. And as you know, there's a chance that this individual, Rauf, is going to be on that bus that same evening. He also knew that the British law enforcement, MI5 in this case, wanted more time and had asked our agency for more time, which we had agreed to at the headquarters level. And Blair had called the president that morning and asked for more time, and the president had agreed to it. So Kayani asked me, will you support us, going into the bus and capturing? And I thought pretty quickly, I said, I'm not going to argue with General Kayani on a hypothetical. So I said, of course, yeah, we will support it. So we leave his house, and General Asmat, who was the head of their counterterrorism unit, had invited me and a few others for dinner. I was leaving the next day back home. All of a sudden, he gets a call from his people at the checkpoint saying the bus is coming. We have permission to come in, to go in the bus. The chief of station was sitting next to me. Asmat turns to him and says, do you concur? And the chief of station turns to me and says, what do we do, boss? Okay. Maybe I had 10, 15 seconds to think through this. On the one hand, the president, wanted more time. Agency had agreed to give more time. On the other hand, we have a guy who is the leader of this plot, and they've already selected the flights, and they may blow him up at any time. And if they blow him up, not only will we lose all kinds of innocent people, but I will be the fall guy, because they will say, let me get this right, Mr. Rodriguez. You are the head of the clandestine service, and you have the authority to do this. And yet you couldn't make a decision. You're done, okay? So I said, yes, we'll do it. Well, they stop the bus, they go in the bus, they grab the guy. By the time we got to the dinner, they had identified that the guy was really Rauf. So I called Gina on secure and says, you better go down the hall and tell the deputy director. And she said, oh my God, oh, shit, I said, you need to go down and tell him. Well, all hell broke loose. The Brits were informed. They went that night. They brought everybody back to their headquarters. They went that night. They grabbed everybody they needed to grab. They shut down Heathrow. Nobody, I couldn't leave that next day, because from the dinner, we didn't eat. I told the chief of station, we need to go back to the station. We need to write our cable to headquarters as to what happened. Why did I do what I did? Send it in. 2 days later, I'm finally leaving. Heathrow is still closed. They send me through Kuwait to Frankfurt home. You couldn't take not even your briefcase or your backpack. You had to put it all. I lost my book on the first two. I lost my sweater on the second one. By the time I get to Dulles, no suitcase, no nothing. I had to stand in line and check with the airline, tell them I'm missing. I'm exhausted. The driver for the DDO was there waiting for me, and he took me home. And as I getting home, my house is all lit up. And I go, oh my God, what's up? Well, my wife's girlfriends, when she taught school many years before, were all there for the weekend. And I'm saying, oh my God, But the bottom line is this. I was under tremendous pressure for a while. The British were angry. They called the director. They wanted me fired. I never heard from the White House, okay? I never heard from the director. And to me, that was validation that they probably agreed to what I did. Later, I found out that the National Security Council every day was meeting saying, what the hell? what happens if the Brits don't have total visibility into the operation? What I mean, if there's aspects to this that they have no clue. So secretly, because they didn't reach out to me to congratulate me either, they just didn't do anything, I am sure that they were pleased that finally this threat, a serious threat that would have killed thousands of people, was finally diffused.
It brings to mind something, Jose. People who listen to this program will remember I interviewed a gentleman named Billy Billingham. He's a former UK Special Air Service, SAS, senior enlisted. He was the ground commander during the 7/7/2005 London coordinated attacks. So when those happened. So the reason I asked the year, you're talking about imminent attacks on British soil 1 year after London got hit.
Yes,
with a coordinated set of attacks. So I understand Blair may have been upset, but I have to imagine our British counterparts were very thankful that that didn't happen again.
Since then, there's a number of documentaries out on this. Netflix, I did one for Netflix. The British have their own version, and they were very kind to me. I mean, they did not, you could tell they were still somewhat peeved, but you got to do what you got to do, and you got to do it best interest of your country, so you call the shots. Had I been wrong, or had I not made the decision and people gotten killed, it would be a completely different story. So, those are the things. But you ask about situations. This is counterterrorism. And counterterrorism, we all agree we need to do what we need to do. Okay? But when I was head of the Panama Task Force, trying to persuade Noriega to leave peacefully, there were a number of things that I could talk about. One of them is I discovered that Noriega was meeting with this witch doctor. He believed in witchcraft, and he talked to his witch doctor all the time, and he would do what the witch doctor would tell him to. So I wrote a memo to my superiors at the time, and I said, I was GS-15 GS-15 at the time. Why don't we recruit the witch doctor? And then we'll tell him to persuade Noriega. We're using his voodoo shit, to go accept the Spanish had offered political asylum for him. Well, I sent it to my immediate supervisor, and then they sent it to the director. The director was a law enforcement, had been in law enforcement. I won't say his name, but it's pretty easy to figure out who was the judge at the agency. He wanted to see me. I get to his office. He hands me back my memo with a big, what was it that it said? Like incredible or whatever. And he said to me, this is, what are you doing? This is a serious organization. Witch doctor? Well, we had to follow then the traditional approach, invade, lost 20 US servicemen, 200 Panamanians. And maybe this would have worked. That's what intelligence is all about. Maybe this type of stuff works, give it a shot, The other thing that I probably need to talk about here is Noriega in 1980, I started to kill US servicemen. And there was a big case there where they killed somebody. And finally, he was going to have elections so he can justify himself staying in power and show the world that he was a Democrat, actually. But he knew he was going to cheat. And I had recruited these Panamanian young technocrats who had figured out how to intercept radio communications from downtown Panama to the outskirts. Because of the lack of land, the repeaters are outside, so they transmit in very low signal, low wattage, and you could intercept the signal. So I go in with a Panamanian, because you have to have a Panamanian accent to say stuff over the airwaves. and a couple other technical types. And we went in black, and we stayed in this safe house.
Jose, what do you mean going in black, just for people who understand?
What
Who
it
don't
means
understand.
is we sneak into the country, okay, with a lot of support from our friends. We sneak into the country. There's no record of us being there, and so the elections we saw started to come in like mid-afternoon, and sure enough, they were winning, and we had satellite communication with people who were doing exit polls, and they would send us the exit polls via satellite communications. And so we would write a script, and our Panamanian friends would say, this program is interrupted, urgent, we interrupt it, give you the right results, the real results of the elections. And of course, it was all that, Noriega was cheating. By 9 o'clock that night, Noriega was sick of this to the point where he just said, this is over, no election, no nothing. And he showed his true colors. And within 3 months, we had to invade to get him out of there, but that was we were concerned because the Cubans were there and they were trying to find us, so we had to make sure that our scripts were tight, and we said what we had to and get off the thing, so.
It just goes to show how innovative these operations are. And I think that's what with how secretive everything is, the thing that I really wish that people knew more is just how innovative officers have to be. And it's not like we have somebody who's just an innovator. It's everyone. It's you who's like, oh, this witch doctor thing could work. And if somebody's listening and thinking, oh, that's an odd way to do it, that's not uncommon. Like that might work, we would try it.
Yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Jose, after reading the book, did you like the agency when you left in the end? And I don't mean not in a charged way, but like you had to fight politically at the highest levels. And it's easy for me, having been in 8 years, I never had to really scrap politically there. But you were at the highest level there. Did you end up with a sour taste in your mouth? You still appreciate that organization? How do you think back on that?
Of course, I really appreciate the organization. I appreciate my friendships there. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I really is just to me just special. Shortly thereafter, I would still be invited to the agency for retirement ceremonies or for whatever. I could not go more than 3 feet when someone would stop me and thank me for doing it, okay? And it was like that for years, still to this day, when I go back to watch them. Now, more and more people have retired and gone away. That to me is the most important thing. Now, our government, yes, I say, God, they give us the authority to go do these things because the homeland is in big trouble, and we might get attacked. And yet, when it comes time, politics will overrule anything, okay? And we've seen this, with the politicians. I'm telling you, 2001, 2002, the press was even with us, okay? The country was with us. The Congress was with us. As the years passed, by 2004, I had left CTC and become the DDO. You could see an erosion in that support that we had from the Congress. And for the 2004 elections, we already started to get some criticism. And it only got worse as the years went by. And again, politics, politics takes over. And to score political points, they are willing to sink those of us who were involved in doing things that our country told us to do and gave us the authority to do, okay? And they gave it to us in writing. It didn't matter. They would come up with, well, yes, you got authority, but you did it too many times, or my concern has always been that at the agency, at the SIS, at the 15 and SIS level, in the 40s, in your 40s, when people are in positions of authority to make decisions. They also are at that stage in life where their kids are going to college, okay? And you have to make a decision between loyalty to your family and loyalty to your country. I mean, it's not, you may be well-intentioned to do what you need to do, but then you think, wow, this can go south. I can be indicted. I can lose all my earnings hiring lawyers to defend myself and my family, and then there's no guarantee that it may work, you know. I wish there was a different way of doing this, you know. I told you that I had officers who were exonerated during one administration only to be investigated again during the second one. I had some wives come to our house to talk to my wife in tears because their husbands were being investigated yet again. And yet again, they had to dig into their savings. Yet again, they had to go through all of this, which I wouldn't want it of the worst enemy, I'll tell you that, you know. In my case, while I was being investigated, I don't know, maybe naively, I thought, I got this, you know. I was pretty sure of, but you know, you never know. You know, there might be zealous prosecutors, you know, who might just indict a ham sandwich, as they say, you know. You never know. But, you know, I still thought about it. My family, my kids were extremely concerned. I mean, they just couldn't believe it, you know. I mean, extremely concerned. My parents, my siblings, my neighbors, everybody who knew us were very concerned about us, extremely concerned about us, you know, until the day that we were exonerated. Let me just make one more point about this. I was very concerned at the beginning when I realized I need to get a lawyer. You know, none of us think about getting a lawyer to defend yourself, and you did. Okay. I was concerned that the FBI was going to come into my house and raid my house because they could at the time. Bob Bennett, one of the most important criminal litigators in our country, took my insurance, which was $100,000. You know, it went away in the first 2 weeks, and then he defended me pro bono, and he made a big, huge difference because then anybody who wanted me had to go through him first, and none of them did. Okay. Now, the bad news is I could still see colleagues of mine, which were not being investigated, but they were being subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury. Who wants to go through the grand jury? We don't enter the agency thinking we're going to have to go testify to the grand jury, you know?
You never think that.
Or spend money on hiring lawyers. And maybe the agency would reimburse you depending on what happened at the end. Those are those things that I think is too bad. And my big concern is about future leaders. Okay, I talked about leadership 40 to 50 or 55 years old. We need them to be able to take the risks and make the decisions they need to make in the best interest of the country, and not do it because they see examples of what happened to me and what happened to others and saying, I just don't want to do that. I don't want to go through that. It's easier to go and serve in a European station and go home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, who needs to do this type of stuff? You know, well, we need people to do it. We need our best people to do it. You know, that's the big concern.
That's well put. Completely understand. When you're signing up, you never in your mind are you like, oh, I might need a lawyer one day if I make the wrong decision here. Yeah. That's just crazy.
The other thing I want to say,
yeah, please.
Another thing is this: I never thought about writing a book. I mean, I did not. I left, but as the time passed after I retired, and I started reading every day, there was newspaper articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the main newspapers, basically implying that I was a torturer. And that the agency was out of line, and that nothing worked, and that nothing came out of this, and all of this crap. Okay, it's really hard to take. And at one point, I said, I have to go on record. I have to write a book. I have to do this. Okay, even though the thought of then dealing with the press, I just said, oh my God, what's worse, but you had to do. And right off the bat, the first thing that I did was be interviewed by 60 Minutes. And I had seen what 60 Minutes had done to George Tenet, for example. And I'm saying, whoa, okay. But the producer actually came to our house a number of times because he wanted to make sure that I was real, that this is a real story. And he wanted to talk to it. And then he got to meet my wife. We invited him for dinner at 5 o'clock. Patty, my wife, would come in with a martini, and we'd have martinis. And he realized, and when we finished filming the second part, my wife went up to him and said to him, you better treat Jose right. I'm going to come and break your legs. Of course, that guy's with us since then, but you go through a lot.
I'm always curious if, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, my gosh, with the horses, the places you've lived and traveled, did anybody just associate you with the world's most interesting man from these commercials?
There was remember there was a commercial, the guy drinks tequila. And what was it that he used to say? And I would say that just to get a reaction.
Yep, the Dos Equis. Yeah.
Yeah, what was it that he would say?
I don't always drink beer, right?
Oh, yes.
But when I do, I drink Dos Equis. And I was thinking, they have pictures of him on a horse jumping over some obstacle. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, oh my gosh, the places you've been. I wanted to ask Jose, just having been in the military and then the agency, I was struck by some of the differences in culture. And I just wonder, from your perspective, are there any traditions or experiences or things that the agency did that you look back on and you miss, that you think on fondly?
In terms of missing the work?
Not just the work, but I remember Vespers maybe, or the way we pass down information orally at the agency. I thought we did such a good job of it. I'm just wondering, as you look back on your time, were there any of those traditions just sitting around with the other case officers, or something else that comes to mind that you really appreciated from your time?
Well, I really appreciated being chief of station. That's probably the best job in the agency. I appreciated everything about it. You're your own person. You chart your own course. You have a chance to work with really good people. You have a chance to really make a difference. To me, it was a big difference. What I miss most from the agency are the people, my friends, the people I served with, very special people. When I left, the first part of my career was 26 years, and then another 7, which it was just balls to the wall. And when I decided, and I could have stayed longer, I said, this is it, I'm done. We all know when we need to leave. This is going to end. I know I will never have a job like this ever, and I haven't. Okay, I've been in the sector ever since, and I haven't. And to me, this is my life, and nobody can take that away. Nobody can take away the experiences, the people, the missions, the accomplishments. The hard times, not everything is good, if you read the book, I had to deal with a lot of stuff as well. In particular, being investigated by a special prosecutor is not, the most fun thing to do either, but just in general. And I go back, I still have a badge. I go back, for different things. And I have a chance to go see friends that are still there and reminisce. And some of them remember every damn decision I ever made, shit that I ever said, they bring it up.
You don't even remember it anymore. And to
No,
them,
I
it's
gotta
like,
go
well,
out of
when
my
Jose
mind.
said this as DDO, of course they
Yeah.
were listening.
Yeah. I tell you, yeah.
I would just say thank you. The last question I ask everybody on my podcast, it's usually for the veterans, the combat veterans, but it applies to anyone in our line of work as well. It's just, as you look back on those tough times, and it's not easy on families either, but just all those years that you spent serving this country, would you go back and do it again?
I would do it all over again. I would make most of the decisions the same, And it's interesting because you know why they pay you in this job to make decisions. And you better be right 98% of the time. Yeah. In my case, I feel that 98% of the time, I made the right call, even though it was a controversial call. And at the time, it was not looked as a good call. Okay. But, I have no regrets whatsoever. I cherish my time at the agency and my colleagues there. It is special. It is special, very special. So, loved it. Loved it.
Yeah. So I would just say thank you again for the time. I would encourage people to pick up hard measures. I know I feel like, and I don't want to speak for you, Jose, I feel like part of it was to set the record straight and kind of lay some groundwork to support the officers that are like myself and those who came after you. But it also tells some really fantastic stories. If you're curious about, hey, it's not all like what you see on Hollywood. There's some crazy operations that we talk about. And so I would encourage people to read it, just not just the decision making, which is tough, but just for some of the lighthearted sides and some of the crazy operations that you get to see. And I think the last thing, I rarely say this on a podcast, but if you do run into somebody who served at the agency or the bureau or these places, I would just thank them for their service the same way you do a veteran from the military. Like, they deserve it. They've been away from family, gotten paid almost nothing for many years to support this country. And I would just ask you to extend the same courtesy to them as you did to any other veteran. And Jose, any last words from you?
Yes, in the book, I also pay tribute to the military officers that I had the good privilege of working with. Senior people, generals, in most cases, but before that, all the different ranks. But people who were very important, and these are people who, I don't care where I am, it would be great. Would have to have a few beers with them because we enjoyed very, very good times. We had Admiral Callan. Did you know Admiral Callan? He was in Special Forces. He was
No.
Yeah. He became deputy director of the agency at some point, and we would sit together at the 5 o'clock meeting. And we would have, and his thing here, he could break it up. And he said, look, if somebody comes attacks me, I can take like this and go like this. And, he was a Navy SEAL before he came, I said, Bert, nobody's going to attack you at the 5 o'clock meeting with the director of Central Intelligence, man. Nobody's going to do that. Okay. Just cool. Just chill. It's a good man. It's a good man.
I love it. Thank you so much, Jose, for just letting us get a peek behind this curtain and hearing more about these decisions you made and paving the way for others. So thank you for the time.
It's been a treat talking to you and give me a chance to talk about some of the things that we did. It's a very special agency that I work for.
I hope you enjoyed this combat story. Here are a couple comments from listeners from previous episodes. Got a couple on the Ryan Fischel episode. And if you recall, he's the the active duty F-15 pilot. And the first one is on YouTube. It's from a subscriber. Thank you for that. J Hill NC says, man, the story of just getting to OTS was a great story in itself. Then he goes into the Syria operations, and I was visualizing everything in the air and on the ground as he was describing it. Thank you, Stinger and Ryan, for this one. I'm proud that we have Stinger as a pilot in the Air Force. He's one smart and humble guy. I hope with his experience and knowledge, he's flying those jets for many more years. Yeah, I definitely think when you hear Ryan's story, Stinger's story in this case, he's been flying since he had the earliest opportunity to do so in some moments when it was probably ill-advised to be up in the air. So I have no doubt he's going to be flying for a while. Thank you for leaving that. And then just one more here from Ben West 2434. Ben says, Ryan, just wanted you to know how much I appreciate your podcast. I listen to it religiously when I'm driving to work and on my days off while operating my skid steer at the ranch. I never served in the military, but I've been a civil servant for the last 21 years. Your format and content is bar none. Thank you and all your guests for your past service and for what you all continue to do. Please keep up the good work. It means a ton. I'm always curious to hear where people listen or watch combat stories. So it's pretty cool for you to have shared that. Thank you for listening to all these episodes. It means so much to me personally. And then just got a couple 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. One is from AMDYFYN. It's titled My Dad. He says, my dad was a decorated combat pilot, but eventually was deceased of his wounds. Love your podcast, as I'm sure my dad would have as well. Which, pretty special, and thank you for taking the time to leave that. And then I really like this one. It's from Joe112P, 5-star review on Apple, and he says, you're so great with the aviators. And he says, as a combat infantryman, I have a great love for aviators who saved more grunts than anyone can imagine. You being a pilot really makes the conversation so natural and entertaining. Keep it going. Yeah, we've had a few aviators on recently with Wiz, Intake, Stinger. I just re-interviewed Kim Campbell, Killer Chick. A lot of you all will remember as the A-10 pilot. You'll see that coming up soon. But been pretty cool talking to all of them, and the response has been great. I think getting a little peek inside the cockpit has been a lot of fun. And also Brian Slade, another Apache guy. So we've had a lot of pilots on recently, and I'm glad that it's landing well with the faithful combat listeners. So thank you all. Have a good one. Stay safe.